Hello and welcome to Ancient and Medieval Worlds, Lecture 10, Part 2 on the founding of Rome. Now, in the first part of our Founding Rome lecture, we looked at the origin myths of Rome, we looked at the situation in Italy, we looked at Rome's innovative tactic for bringing new people into their growing empire. We don't often call it an empire yet, but that's kind of what they were doing, that they were giving levels of citizenship out to other peoples as they conquered, allowing them to build larger armies. And we looked at the significance of this military tactic in the influential war they fought against Pyrrhus of Epirus, one of these minor Hellenistic kings. In this part of the lecture, we're going to really look closely at how the Republic was organized. This is going to be very important for understanding the collapse of the Roman Republic in a couple of lectures when we look at what's often called by modern historians the Roman Revolution, a series of civil wars that brought down the Republic and began the monarchical Roman Empire proper. So we need to go over how Rome was governed. It's going to come up again and again in the next few lectures. Who were these Roman citizens voting for? How was the voting done? It was extremely complicated, and nowhere was it completely written down in the way that the United States has its own written constitution. Here are a few quick initial points for you to think about all the way through. First, the Romans never gave up something old just because they put something new that might have been able to replace it. So there's a lot of confusing overlap and old rules that cease to match current usage. Romans had enormous respect for precedent and the way of the ancestors, the mos maiorum, literally the way of the greater ones. Of course, they often disagreed about how the ancestors had actually done these things, especially in circumstances that their ancestors had never had to deal with, such as ruling the entire Mediterranean. And this is very similar to something that Americans today should be familiar with. We often talk about the Founding Fathers, but none of us seem to agree on what the Founding Fathers actually would have done in a given situation. Second, while birth did not technically limit your ability to become a magistrate, one of the elected offices, unless you had been born a slave, you couldn't ever then become a magistrate, practically speaking, you had to be rich. And in fact, there were minimum wealth as well as age qualifications for some of the higher offices. This should also remind us of Solon's reforms in Athens. In addition, magistrates were not paid. These positions were sought after because they were a key way to receive public distinction and prestige. And of course, there were many ways to use these political positions to make money, but that was frowned on, albeit extremely common. Third, Roman government, like the Greek polis, was personal. You had to show up in person to run for office, and you had to show up in person to vote. And that limited who could vote in practical terms. You had to be rich enough or close enough to afford the time off to actually go to an assembly to vote, especially if you came from a town that had just received full Roman citizenship but might be hundreds of miles away in Italy. No absentee ballots were allowed. Practically, this limited the benefits of extending the fullest forms of Roman citizenship, although many of the other elements of the citizenship status were beneficial. You had a better status in law, for instance. Romans had a similar system to the United States' branches of government, with checks and balances and allotted powers, and that's not a coincidence. The United States' founding fathers borrowed heavily from the Roman system of government, much more so than they did from any Greek polis. Well, let's take a look over it now. We'll start with the elected magistrates. There were a series of increasingly more powerful positions. So there were lower magistrates and then a series of increasing ranks of magistrates. You generally had to serve in one of the more numerous lower tier positions before advancing up the chain. This was actually often referred to as the ladder of offices or the cursus honorum in Latin. We're only going to look at a couple of examples, including the most important ones, the two consuls who sat at the top of the ladder. Central to this system was the idea that a magistrate served for a limited period of time, usually 1 year, and that he, and they were all men, generally would wait a long time before standing for that office again. And finally, that every office had at least 2 occupants, so that one could veto the other. Thus, at the top, there were 2 consuls. Each consul could stop the other from doing anything, as well as any lesser magistrate. So, Roman magistrates were both annual and collegial. And this was because, while the Romans may not have remembered their kings very accurately, they had a strong opinion that kings were bad, and they wanted to prevent another king from arising. In fact, it was technically legal under Roman law to kill someone who was trying to become king. Regicide was legal under Roman law. Roman magistrates were almost all also military officers. Particularly the consuls were the most important generals, and they fulfilled both civilian and military responsibilities. Now, that's similar to what we saw in the Greek polis with the strategoi of Athens. In special circumstances, the state elected special, more powerful officers. Censors, like Cato the Elder, who we'll be reading about, were, for instance, elected every 5 years to update the voter rolls and determine who had enough money to run for office, as well as kick out disreputable senators. I believe this is the etymological origin of both terms of censoring. A census, that's what the censors did. They conducted a census, but they could also censor people. In an emergency, another special officer could be elected called a dictator, literally one who speaks. When the Romans decided they just needed one person to fix their problems by himself, and they recognized that 2 consuls might be arguing with each other. However, the dictator's term of office and the extent of their powers were supposed to be strictly limited to whatever problem the dictator was elected to solve. That was usually an invading army. This position was irregular, and no dictator was elected for the entirety of the 100s BCE, for over a century. Next came the Senate, a group of all former magistrates, usually several hundred people. That is, anyone who had been elected to any of those magistracies that we saw in the previous branch of government immediately entered this second branch of government, the Senate. Technically, the Senate was simply an advisory body, with the idea being that these people had all had experience running the government. But its prestige and actual power were immense. The term senator means old man, as in wise and respectable. This is a literal patriarchy. The Roman state actually called itself the Senate and the people of Rome. And you'll often see this as a stand-in for Rome. SPQR, Senatus Populusque Romanorum, the Senate and the people of Rome. Notice how Senate comes first. In practice, the Senate controlled financial and foreign policy, increasingly so as the Roman Republic expanded and conquered more and more territory, and there needed to be a select group of people constantly in session able to deal with problems as they came up, something that you wouldn't necessarily call the entire assembly for every single time. And so the Roman Senate increasingly gained more and more power to itself, particularly, as I said, on financial and foreign policy. Now, technically, it did not pass legislation, but whatever legislation it suggested was almost always passed by the people's assemblies, which we're going to get to next. That's the third branch. It's worth noting, too, that only the Senate could hold formal debates, not the people's assemblies, meaning that the Senate was the primary place where legislation was actually composed and amended before it went up for a vote. Since the Senate was made up of ex-magistrates who had to meet minimum wealth qualifications to become magistrates, the Senate was effectively a body made up of the rich, and it tended to be quite conservative as a result. Finally, the people, meaning all free adult male citizens of Rome, met in assemblies, this third branch. There were several different assemblies organized in different ways. There were at least 4 of them. It's deeply confusing, and it seems to have sometimes even confused the Romans themselves, particularly with the older assemblies that sort of technically remained on the books but weren't called anymore. There were critical differences between them in the ways that they met, though. For instance, when the citizens came together in the one that in the assembly that voted for most of the magistrates, like the consuls, they organized themselves in the same way that the draft for the Roman army was supposed to be organized, or at least initially had been organized, with the smaller, more elite units, composed of those men who could afford the best equipment, like horses, having the same pull as the poorer, much larger units. So effectively, the rich had more say in voting, but the poor still held a voice. There's something in the order. This is the Centuriate Assembly. There's over 150 different units, but the smallest units were composed of only a couple of dozen men, while the largest were composed of thousands. And each unit voted, got one vote. But part of the deal that the plebeians had struck with the patricians way back in the early Roman history, the early part of the Roman Republic that we talked about in part 1 of this lecture, was that they would get their own assembly, a plebeian assembly, with the ultimate right to make laws over the whole state without the patricians. And the plebeian assembly continued to hold this right long after the original economic distinctions between the patricians and the wealthiest of the plebeians were gone. But since the patricians were still a minority, this really only excluded a few among the very rich families from the plebeian assembly, probably less than 1% of the voting population. Still, the plebeian assembly had what we might call populist tendencies in memory of the old class distinctions, and they elected special plebeian-only magistrates who were called tribunes, technically tribunes of the plebs. And those tribunes of the plebs, despite being a rather minor office, could technically veto any other magistrate, even consuls. Theoretically, the reason for this was originally that they would protect the plebs from the abuse of patrician magistrates. But this now became a potential loophole in the Roman system that we will later see was used to grind the whole legislative process to a halt. That wasn't the reason that the tribunes of the plebs had received their power. But as we saw, Rome never threw out old laws, and for a long time the system was not abused simply by custom. Rather than by any official rules. And that's really what kept the Roman state functioning in many cases. Remember that nowhere is this complex constitution all written down in one place. Our best descriptions of it actually come from Greek historians who were trying to make sense of it and explain it to other Greeks. For most Romans, it was simply known. It was tradition. And so it was tradition that kept these things functioning in the way that they were thought to have originally been intended. But when people were willing to break with tradition, the whole system could rapidly grind to a halt, as we'll see in a couple of lectures. Again, for these assemblies of the people, you had to show up in person to vote, which limited a huge theoretical voting body across multiple cities, given all those extensions of Roman citizenship that we saw, to an actuality a few thousand men who could meet in the public spaces of Rome itself. Moreover, while the people in assembly voted for or against the laws, they could only legally assemble when a magistrate called for an assembly, and they could only vote up or down on a law proposed by a magistrate or by the Senate. In practice, the people's voice was quite limited, but still important enough that the elite who monopolized public office had to at least pay them lip service. At the very least, these assemblies voted for the magistrates, who of course also ended up becoming the members of the Senate. As you can see, the Roman Republic, a Latin word that literally means the public thing, or a more archaic translation into English would be commonwealth, was a complicated body, and it skewed heavily in favor of the status quo and the rich. But despite this, it was highly admired by rich and poor Romans alike. Even Greek commentators saw this system as a combination of the best qualities of monarchy, the consuls, oligarchy, the Senate, and democracy, the assemblies. And for hundreds of years, the Republic worked and led Rome to build a Mediterranean empire under a, relatively speaking, democratic-style government, until the system broke down and produced the most powerful despots of all time in the emperors. And that's a story that we're going to trace over the next several lectures. But first we need to see how it all worked in theory, or at least what the Romans thought of as traditional, before we can see how it broke down under the pressures of ruling a vast empire. And I want to point that out here. The Roman Empire was built by the Roman Republic. It's the Republic that gives birth to the emperors. Well, with that, we'll end our lecture on the birth of Rome. Next time, we'll look at how Rome came to be master of the Mediterranean.